Alrighty, class. Welcome to Chapter 11 of Medieval Europe. Before we jump into Chapter 11, what do we usually do before we jump in? That's right, we review our previous chapter. Alright, and I was going to play some music, some little background vibes to get us ready, but I forgot, so I'm going to take my headphones off. Okay, so in Chapter 10, we learned about the life of a serf. Remember, the serf and his turf. We learned that a serf was a freedman who changed his freedom, or he traded in his freedom for security, right? He wanted a place to live, wanted a place to work, he wanted a protection, and so he would go live on the manor estate and work for the lord or the knight, the one who owned the land, in exchange for that protection, that security. We learned that he worked in the land, that he was the one that helped with the mill, making bread, working in the land, taking care of animals, and then he making the weapons, and he would exchange those things. He would give his taxes to the Lord, and then he would keep anything that he had left over. And so we learned about the life of a serf. So today we're going to read chapter 11, City Life. So our primary focus objectives is to be able to learn about the conditions in a European city during the Middle Ages. So what was city life like in the Middle Ages? We want to be able to know the role and power of guilds. What is a guild and what power do they have? Learn the relationship between cities and feudalism. Remember, the feudal system is what we've been learning about, how there is the king of the land. He gives land to lords and knights. They give land to lesser lords. Lesser lords give little portions of land for the serfs to work in the land. And then, as always, be able to learn the core vocabulary words for chapter 11, and you get extra credit for using that sentence in a sentence and submitting it into the text entry box for this assignment of the lesson. So, let us get started, all right? So as we read this lesson, we're going to learn about the life of the serfs and learn more about the lives of the serfs and understand how city life was different and be able to have a clear compare and contrast. We'll also learn more about the church hierarchy and the rules of Benedict monasteries. Remember, we learned about Benedict, and so we'll learn about the rules of the Benedictine monasteries. Sorry, that word's a little tough to say. And help us understand the guilds, right, and the power they have. So let's call attention to the big question. How was life in a medieval city different from life on a manor estate? So the manor estates seem to be kind of like in the countryside. So what is going to be the difference with the medieval city? So the city life. So as we read, look for answers to that question. So let's start reading, and I'll have you follow along. All right. So a serf goes to the city. Now that you've read about the difficulties of a serf's life, you will not be surprised to learn that sometimes serfs ran away from the manor city. Some set off to live in the city. Imagine a young serf who has spent his entire life in the countryside. He spends his days in the fields working side by side with other serfs. Then one day the serf, let's call him Peter, is sent to the city to sell some firewood. He must sell the wood and bring the money back. He leaves home with a cart filled with firewood. Wow, I'm struggling to say firewood. Firewood. Before the trip, Peter had heard many stories about life in the city, but none of these stories prepared him for the reality of the city. So here is a depiction of the city life. The hustle and bustle around shops added to the excitement of city life. Who's this dude? Just staring right at us. For a young man who spends his days in open fields, the crowds of people pressing against him are a terrible shock. Peter would never have guessed that the whole world contained this many people. Peter is astonished by the gangs of children at play, the women carrying baskets of fruit, and the men pushing small herds of sheep before them. And yet none of these people pay any attention to Peter whatsoever. The city has many churches, but although there are places to pray, there are dangers too. Everywhere he looks, he sees thieves and beggars. Even though it is a sunny day, there are times when Peter can't see the sky to tell what time it is. Some of the narrow streets are shadowed by rows of buildings. He listens for the toll of church bells to know the time. Peter is excited by all the new sights, but he is also horrified by some of the new smells. As a serf, he is used to a certain amount of odors, but the city smells are worse than anything he has smelled before. People dump waste from animals and people into open drains and ditches. Rainy weather has turned the dirt streets to stinky mud tracks. People selling meat and fish throw their unsold rotten foods into the streets. Dogs and pigs roam around trying to make a meal of the garbage. Maybe Scotland's new dog was from this city. I'm just kidding. The river is filled with all kinds of garbage too, including dead animals. Nevertheless, Peter is fascinated with the city and city life. After selling his firewood, Peter begins to make his way home. Peter cannot stop thinking about the sights and sounds of the city. Then he makes a decision. He will run away to live there. As he continues home, he begins to make a plan. After a few weeks back on the manor estate, Peter escapes to the city. What is Peter going to do there? He is a farmer. How can he make his living in this city? Peter isn't sure, but he knows that much of the excitement in the streets is due to people selling and buying goods and services. So maybe some vendors, right? The streets are full of shops. There are tailors, barbers, furriers, grocers, carpenters, cobblers, leather tanners, and bakers. These shops are more like market stalls opening right onto the busy street. In the back of each shop, people will make the items that will be sold in the shops. Peter wants to find a way to work in a shop. He goes from place to place, talking with shopkeepers and clerks about how to find a job. So here's a little picture of Peter, and everywhere he looked, people buying and selling all kinds of goods. So let's look at some of these goods, right? Tailors, people that probably tailor clothes to fit better. Barbers, to cut your hair. Furriers, maybe to make what Peter's wearing, this little hoodie with some fur. Grocers, people with groceries or food. Carpenters, those that work with wood. Cobblers, those that work with shoes. Leather tanners, leather could be used for bags, a lot of different things. Clothes, so someone that tans the leather to make it look a certain way. And bakers for food, right? He has all these different things, and maybe he wants to join one of those. So guilds. In his discussion with shopkeepers and clerks, Peter discovers that each type of business is organized into a guild. And here is your first vocabulary word, right? I haven't missed one. It's kind of crazy to go that many pages without a vocabulary word. So a guild is a group of businessmen who control a certain craft. So if we go back up and look at these different shops, and these tailors and barbers, furs, grocers, all these guys are probably associated with a guild of tailors, a guild of bakers, a guild of carpenters. So for example, there are guilds for shoemakers, carpenters, hat makers, tailors, clockmakers, and jewelers, right? That's just what we just said. The leading members of each guild, called master craftsmen, make rules for their craft in the city. They are called craftsmen because they are mostly men, though there are some women too. The guilds set standards for things like product quality and training. Guilds require would-be members to train for a certain number of years with a guild member. Most start out as apprentices when they are children, helping their master at work. So let's pause right there. Apprentice. Maybe you can think of Star Wars. You know, Luke was an apprentice to Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon. So apprentice is a person who is learning a trade from a master craftsman. So continue to read. Peter learns that he is too old to start as an apprentice. Oh no, what is he going to do? Right here is a picture that's showing that apprentices usually are young children who spend many years to learn that craft or skill. When an apprentice proves himself or herself to be skillful in the craft, he or she is promoted to journeyman. All right, let's pause there and learn what a journeyman is. A journeyman is a guild member who is considered qualified to work for wages in a particular trade. So they're apprentice, not learning money, but just learning the skill, but then they get promoted to someone who is qualified to work for wages, to earn money. Remember with the vocabulary words to use the definitions from the book. Some students have been using definitions from just Googling it. You will not get full credit for that. I want you to be in your book, learning the stuff in the book. And so the only way I can know that you've gotten into the book is using the vocabulary word, the definitions from the book, all right? Okay, so let's continue to read. Make sure you're following along. At this point, talking about Peter, this is actually still talking about the apprentice becoming journeyman. So at this point, he or she is allowed to practice the trade in the community and earn wages. A journeyman might work for the master he apprenticed with, or he might go into business with another journeyman. A journeyman will work this way for many years to prove himself to be highly skilled in his craft and a reliable member of the guild. Finally, the journeyman can request that the guild raise him to the status of master. Part of the process of becoming a master required that the journeyman produce a masterpiece. And a masterpiece is a perfect example of a finished product of some craft. So maybe the perfect shoe. A masterpiece is a perfect example of a finished product of his craft. For example, a shoemaker's masterpiece is a pair of perfect shoes, ones that you just have to wear, right? That feel so good. I would say Nike and Adidas, Under Armour, they're probably masters of their craft, making many masterpieces. The masterpiece is proof that a journeyman has the skills to continue the high standards of the guild. Okay, just a few more pages, guys, and we're almost done. Okay, just about basically 2 more pages. Okay, so the growth of trade in cities. So we've learned about the serf going to the city and looking at all these different vendors and knowing that the vendors are actually part of guilds and how to become a member of the guild and to be an apprentice and at some point become the master craftsman. So now let's learn about the growth of trade in cities. So between the fall of Rome and about the year 1000, there was not much travel or trade among areas in Europe. As Europe became somewhat safer from bandits and outlaws, trade began to increase. Merchants now needed people to carry their goods to other towns and cities to sell. Just like we read in China, the Dynasty of China, how they would carry their goods on those caravans, especially their silk. Peter decides to look for work in the growing trade between cities. Cities in Europe grew along with trade and business. London, Paris, Venice, and many other cities began to expand. Many people preferred city life to a life on a manor. The growth of towns and cities had an impact on local governments, businesses, and the feudal system itself. Eager to establish local governments, towns offered their king, or sometimes a lord, a sum of money for a charter. All right, here is our last vocabulary word for chapter 11. Charter is a document given by a ruler to a group of people that allows them to elect their own government officials. Okay, so a charter was a document that granted townspeople permission to elect their own mayors, sheriffs, and other officials. However, the only people who could vote in these elections were the powerful merchants. This picture shows churches, government buildings, guild halls, shops, and houses crowded behind the safety of city walls during the Middle Ages. So remember, we learned about castles and how there's actually a city basically within the castle. From around 1000 onward, the feudal lords slowly began to lose influence and power to the kings. People were required to be loyal to the king, but their ties to lords were weakening. Kings used the wealth from towns and cities to become more powerful. Over time, strong kings established kingdoms such as England, France, and Castile, central Spain. However, just as the decline of the Western Roman Empire happened over a long period of time, the decline of the feudal system took many years too. Okay, and that is our chapter 11, okay? Just chapter 12 is our last chapter for this week. So before we end, let's refresh the big question. How was life in a medieval city different from life on a manor estate? Okay, so just think about life on the manor estate, the work that they had to perform there, and then think about the work that was done in the city. Were there more Pippi? Were there more people in the city or more people on the manor estate? Okay, and what kind of work was done on both? And that will help you with the big question. All right, thanks for coming in and watching this lesson. Some of you guys are getting ahead, which is awesome, but just make sure you are reading the material. I can tell if the answers to your questions, the big questions, or answers to vocabulary words, or for instance with science, I can tell if it's actually being read from the book or if you're probably just Googling it and copy and pasting, okay? So let's get into the material. Let's get into our books and learn the material we should be learning. If you have questions, please reach out to me. Make sure you are getting on top of things, staying on track. We only have a couple weeks until Thanksgiving, and we want to enjoy Thanksgiving break for all the beautiful gloriousness that week has for us, right? To be able to relax and spend time with family and friends and eat delicious food, okay? So let's get on top of our schoolwork, and I will see you guys in the next video.